Yesterday, I uploaded a video about industry capture and how RFK Jr. is wrong when he says that health authorities like the FDA are captured by pharmaceutical industries and are simply letting drugs pass without actually reviewing them. Because in his mind, they're colluding together or something. But anti-vaccine advocates and people like RFK Jr. will often point to examples in history that they think support this idea that health authorities are captured by industry. And they'll paint these examples as cautionary tales that they can broadly apply to every single pharmaceutical drug and why we shouldn't trust it. One of those drugs is a drug called thalidomide, which you might have heard as causing major birth defects in the 1960s and 50s. It definitely did do those things. It was a big disaster. But anti-vaxxers like to distort history and paint this example in a way that just is totally dishonest and not true. And as always is the case when anti-vaxxers distort history like this, you lose a lot of really useful history that can really teach you a lot and highlights some awesome heroes in this example that definitely deserve to have their stories told. So today I'm going to talk about that and this whole story. Hey, I'm Dr. Wilson. I'm a PhD molecular biologist, and welcome to day 4 of Debunking Week. So like I said, thalidomide is a drug that was responsible for birth defects in the 1950s and early 1960s. It had its beginnings in 1956 in West Germany when it was approved to be marketed without a prescription for a bunch of different symptoms. Then in 1958, a company based in the UK called Distillers Company Biochemicals got permission to market thalidomide as a remedy for morning sickness, but they didn't have any evidence for this whatsoever. After a few years of the drug being on the market, in 1961, an Australian obstetrician named Dr. William McBride, who originally helped popularize the use of thalidomide, published a letter in The Lancet reporting that he was seeing 1 in 5 patients who took the drug while pregnant, giving birth to babies with several abnormalities. Then in that same year, in 1961, a federal investigation in West Germany ended with the distribution of thalidomide being halted. In that same year, the UK did the same. By 1962, most countries had banned the use of thalidomide. But at this point, a lot of damage had been done. There were an estimated 10,000 cases of severe birth defects associated with thalidomide. And there was also an increased risk of pregnancy loss for those who took the drug while pregnant. This was an absolutely huge tragedy, and I'll get to talking about some of the regulation reforms that this caused. But usually the story stops here for most people, and most people don't end up knowing other details of what happened. For example, it's not well known that the US actually didn't see as much damage from thalidomide. And that's because the FDA refused to approve it. Yes, that's right. The FDA, which if you listen to RFK Jr. and other anti-vaxxers will say is being paid off by Big Pharma, refused to approve this drug. The hero in this story is Dr. Frances Oldham Kelsey. She worked as a medical officer at the FDA, and one of the drugs that she was reviewing was thalidomide. She refused to approve thalidomide in the US on the grounds of inadequate safety data. But the company that was applying for permission to market thalidomide in the US was persistent. They continued to send data to Dr. Kelsey, insisting that the drug was safe and insisting that they should be granted permission to market it. But Dr. Kelsey was adamant that reliable scientific safety data was just not there for this drug, and she refused to approve it. She stood her ground against pressure from a pharmaceutical company. And her decision was vindicated because just a year after all of these refusals, it was shown that thalidomide was responsible for these birth defects. Dr. Kelsey even received a Distinguished Federal Service Award from John F. Kennedy. His nephew fell pretty far from the tree, huh? Even though thalidomide never got regulatory approval from the FDA in the US, there was still some distribution of it within the US. So following this disaster, there was a lot of regulatory reform as to how pharmaceutical companies are regulated with their drugs. And these changes were essentially a crackdown on the pharmaceutical industry, making it more difficult and more stringent for them to get drugs approved. This included tightening the ways that people have access to drugs like thalidomide, because it was available over the counter. For example, the UK ended up distinguishing between prescription-only medications, medicines available from a pharmacy without a prescription, and medicines available in any store without a prescription. All of these three drug classes have different regulatory contexts to them. In the US, these changes included some pretty basic things that today are considered essential. For example, before these regulatory changes, manufacturers were allowed to market a drug if the FDA had not acted within 60 days of receiving an application from the manufacturer. After these regulations, that time period tripled and added requirements from the manufacturers to prove the efficacy of their drugs before they go to market and report any adverse events. It also required that evidence in the submission be based on adequate, well-controlled studies conducted by qualified experts, and there were several more changes in these regulatory reforms that just made it more stringent and more difficult for drug companies to get drugs onto the market. And that's a good thing. We don't want just any drug out there on the market for anybody to take and misuse and abuse. And all the pharmaceutical industry is subject to these very strict regulations, unlike the health and wellness industry, which can sell you pretty much anything and make any claim as long as they put a little asterisk at the bottom of their page. It also led to research into understanding why thalidomide caused these birth defects. The reason is that thalidomide has what we call in chemistry enantiomers. Enantiomers are basically two molecules that have the same chemical formula and very, very similar chemical structures that differ in just one way, and it's that they are mirrored. Another way you can think of this analogy is if I had to get into a door where a key is my left hand, and I can only use my left hand as a key to fit into that keyhole to open that door, I could not use my right hand because it is shaped differently. In the molecular world, this tiny structural difference can have huge consequences for biological systems. And that's basically what happened with thalidomide. One form of thalidomide is used in biological processes, no problem. But the other form of thalidomide kind of gunks up and breaks these biological processes. So in a developing fetus, when these biological processes are inhibited or blocked or just generally messed up, that's how they got those birth defects. This also led to a standard in clinical trials where pregnant women are generally not included in clinical trials for new drugs. Women are still included in clinical trials and may become pregnant during the clinical trial, but they're generally not encouraged to do that. And this has made studying the effects of drugs during pregnancy difficult, which is just a tricky problem that's kind of outside the scope of this video, but I thought it was worth mentioning. But the take-home message here is that in this huge case in history that anti-vaxxers constantly bring up as a reason to distrust health authorities and distrust government is actually an example of the FDA not bowing to pressures from a pharmaceutical industry and instead sticking to science and standing up for the right way to do things. And very recently, there was another example of something like this happening, because during the COVID pandemic, there was a huge push and incentive to develop and test and approve COVID vaccines so that we could help deal with the pandemic. There were some big pharmaceutical players in the race for getting these vaccines to market. And ultimately, the players with the most money and biggest infrastructure weren't the ones who ended up winning. But the bigger point to this story is that before the 2020 election, then President Donald Trump was dealing with a lot of political pressure because of the COVID pandemic and all of the chaos and destruction and death it was bringing to the United States. So before the election, he actually had the head of the FDA in his office and was reportedly demanding that the FDA approve COVID vaccines before the election so that he could have that as a political talking point. This was probably a huge amount of pressure from a sitting president demanding that a regulatory body do something. But the head of the FDA stood his ground and said, no, we cannot release these early. We have to finish safety review and we have to do it the right way.
But Dr. Wilson, the head of the FDA, probably said that because pharma was paying him.
Again, the richest companies before the pandemic were not the winners of the vaccine race. Moderna was a relatively small pharmaceutical company before the COVID pandemic, and Pfizer was not part of Project Warp Speed. It was funded mostly through German sources. So like I said in yesterday's video, this idea that pharma is in bed with regulatory agencies and thus we shouldn't trust drugs in general is just a really lazy argument that doesn't actually hold up when you look at the history and the facts of what's happened in this country. So that's a little bit of history and a little bit of science in this video, and I hope you've enjoyed it. And that's going to do it for day 4 of Debunking Week. All of the links to all of the science and history that I talk about in this video are linked in the description below so that you can check them out for yourself. And as always, if you enjoyed this, then don't forget to subscribe so you can catch me tomorrow for the final video of Debunking Week, where I'll be debunking Vinay Prasad. See you then.